Story number 1.
The road leading to Black Hollow was quiet this time of night. The trees hung low, their branches stretching like fingers over the cracked pavement, forming a tunnel of darkness. The headlights of Michael's car barely cut through the fog rolling in from the hills, and with every mile, the town behind him seemed more like a distant memory. He had heard the stories. Everyone had. Black Hollow was abandoned decades ago, left to rot in silence. They said it was cursed, that something happened there, something no one liked to talk about. But Michael wasn't superstitious. He was a photographer, and Black Hollow was the perfect subject for his next project. A town frozen in time, untouched by modern hands, left only to nature and the ghosts of its past. The road narrowed until it became a dirt path, his tires crunching over loose gravel. He checked the time, 11:42 p.m. Perfect. He would get his shots and be back before sunrise. His car came to a stop at the town's edge. It wasn't much, just a cluster of buildings, their wooden frames sagging, their windows like empty eyes staring into nothing. An old gas station stood to the left, its rusted sign swaying in the wind. Across from it, a diner sat in eerie silence, its entrance barely hanging onto its hinges. Michael stepped out, adjusting the strap of his camera bag. The air was thick, heavy, and smelled of damp wood and decay. He took his first shot, click. The old gas station's faded red paint peeling in thick layers. As he moved deeper into town, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. But there was no one here. There couldn't be. Click. He snapped a shot of a row of abandoned houses. The porches were caved in, the doors ajar. Black Hollow had been left in a hurry. Click. Another photo, this time of a rusted-out pickup, its tires flat, its windshield a spiderweb of cracks. He glanced at the LCD screen of his camera, reviewing the images. His breath caught in his throat. In the photo of the houses, a figure stood in the window of the nearest one. His fingers trembled as he zoomed in. It was faint, barely there, but unmistakable. A silhouette, motionless, staring right at him. Michael spun around, aiming his camera at the house. The window was empty. He swallowed hard. It was just a trick of the light. That's what he told himself. But something about this place, about the way the silence seemed to hum, made his skin crawl. Click. He took another picture, this time of the diner's front door. It looked as if someone had tried to claw their way out. The wood was splintered, deep scratches running down its length. The wind picked up, carrying with it a sound. Faint at first, almost like whispers. Michael turned sharply. Nothing. Just the buildings, standing quiet and broken. Then, from somewhere in the darkness, a laugh. Soft. Childlike. His heart hammered against his ribs. He wasn't alone. The laugh came again, closer this time. Michael's hands were slick with sweat as he gripped his camera. He stepped backward, his foot catching on a loose rock. He stumbled, catching himself against a rusted mailbox. He had to leave. Now, but something stopped him. The diner's door was open. He was sure it had been closed a moment ago. Inside, the darkness was thick, suffocating. A whisper drifted through the air, curling around him like smoke. "Help me." Michael's stomach knotted. It had been right next to his ear. He ran. His boots slammed against the pavement as he sprinted for his car. The laughter followed. Higher now. Louder. The wind howled as he reached for the car door, but it wouldn't budge. Locked. His hands shook as he dug into his pocket for the keys. Click. The sound of a camera shutter. Michael froze. He hadn't taken a picture. Slowly, he turned his head. There, in the reflection of the diner's shattered window, he saw it. A figure. Thin. Unmoving. Watching. The keys fell from his hand. The figure took a step closer. Michael's breath hitched, another step, and then the whisper, right against his ear. "You shouldn't have come." The last thing he remembered was the cold. And then darkness. Story, the end.
Story number 2.
The road to Hollow Creek was always eerily quiet at night. It was a long, winding stretch of cracked asphalt that cut through dense woods where the trees loomed over like silent sentinels. Noah had driven down this road countless times before, but tonight, something felt off. The trip back to his childhood home should have been a peaceful one. His mother had asked him to house sit while she was away visiting relatives, and he had agreed without hesitation. It wasn't that he enjoyed being alone in that creaky old farmhouse. It was just easier than staying in his cramped apartment in the city. Out here, there was space. Out here, there was quiet. But this time, the quiet felt suffocating. The closer he got to the house, the thicker the darkness seemed to grow, as though the night itself was swallowing the world whole. His headlights barely cut through the fog that had settled in the fields. The farmhouse stood at the end of a dirt path, its silhouette barely visible against the black sky. As he pulled up, the porch light flickered once and went out. "Perfect," Noah muttered, shutting off the engine. The house was just as he remembered, tall, narrow, its paint peeling, windows staring like empty eyes. He fumbled with his keys, the chill in the air biting at his skin as he unlocked the door. The hinges groaned as he pushed it open, revealing the dimly lit interior. Everything was the same. The old grandfather clock in the hall still ticked its solemn rhythm. The wooden floors still creaked under his weight, and the scent of aged wood and dust still clung to the air like a memory refusing to fade. Noah locked the door behind him and exhaled. He had never liked being in this house alone at night. As a child, he would wake up to strange sounds. Soft scratching against the walls, muffled footsteps in the hall. His mother had always dismissed it as the house settling or just the wind. But even back then, he had felt it. That creeping sensation that something watched him from the shadows. Shaking off the unease, he made his way to the kitchen. He poured himself a glass of water and took a sip, the cold liquid soothing his dry throat. The house groaned softly around him as if stretching in the stillness. Then came the whisper, a faint, almost inaudible voice. Noah froze, his grip tightening around the glass. It had come from upstairs. He turned slowly, staring up at the darkened staircase. The air in the room felt heavier now, pressing against his chest. His rational mind told him it was just his imagination. The old house was playing tricks on him. Then he heard it again, a hushed, dragging whisper. This time, the words were clear. "Noah." His breath caught in his throat. He set the glass down carefully, his heart pounding. The sound had come from his childhood bedroom, the one room he had always felt most afraid of. His fingers trembled as he reached for his phone, but the screen remained dark. Dead battery. A sharp creak echoed from upstairs. Something was moving. Noah forced himself to move, his feet carrying him toward the staircase despite the warning screams in his head. The wood groaned beneath his steps as he climbed, each one slow, deliberate. When he reached the top, the hallway stretched before him like a tunnel of darkness. His old bedroom door stood slightly ajar, a sliver of black beyond it. He took a shaky breath and pushed the door open. The room was just as he had left it years ago, except for one thing, the rocking chair in the corner. It was moving, back and forth, back and forth. Noah's stomach twisted. The chair had belonged to his grandmother before she passed, and it had always unsettled him. As a child, he would wake up to find it swaying gently in the darkness, as if someone had just been sitting in it. "Noah." The whisper brushed against his ear, cold as the grave. His blood ran ice cold. He turned sharply, eyes darting around the room. No one was there. Then the chair stopped. Silence. Noah's pulse roared in his ears as he backed toward the door. His hand was slick with sweat as he reached for the light switch. The moment his fingers touched it, the bulb flickered and burst, while plunging the room into darkness. The whisper came again, but this time it was behind him. He spun around, his breath hitching in his throat. A figure stood in the doorway. A tall, gaunt figure, its face obscured by shadow. Its presence filled the room with an overwhelming sense of dread. Noah stumbled back, his legs trembling. The figure did not move, but the air around it grew colder. The shadows deepened, and then it spoke. "You should not have come back." The voice was not human. It was something deeper, something ancient. It echoed in his bones, vibrating through his skull. Noah turned and bolted. Down the hall, down the stairs. The floorboards shuddered beneath his feet as he ran, his breath ragged. He didn't dare look back. He could feel it behind him, feel the weight of its gaze. The front door loomed ahead, but as he reached for the handle, it slammed shut, locked. The whispers swarmed around him now, growing louder, overlapping, a chorus of voices from the dark. "You left us. You forgot. You belong to us." His vision blurred, his knees buckled. The house swallowed the light. The last thing Noah saw was the rocking chair, moving, back and forth, back and forth. Story the end.
Story number 3.
The wind howled through the empty fields as Jonathan parked his truck in front of the old farmhouse. The structure loomed against the dark sky, its windows black and empty. The house had been in his family for generations, abandoned for the past 10 years, after his grandfather passed. It had taken him this long to muster the courage to return, to finally go through the belongings and decide what to do with the place. Jonathan wasn't a superstitious man, but standing before the house, he couldn't deny the weight that settled in his chest. His childhood had been spent here, summers running through the fields, winters huddled by the fireplace. But the nights had always been different. Even as a child, he had sensed something lurking in the walls, something that whispered in the dark corners of the house. Shaking off the uneasy feeling, he grabbed his duffel bag and walked up the steps. The key turned stiffly in the lock, and the door creaked open, releasing a gust of stale air. The scent of dust and old wood filled his nostrils as he stepped inside. The house was just as he had left it. Furniture draped in white sheets, cobwebs stretched across the ceiling beams. The grandfather clock in the hallway had stopped, frozen at 3:12. Jonathan ran his fingers over the wooden banister, memories rushing back. His grandfather had been a stern but kind man, always warning him not to wander the house at night. "There are things that wake when the moon is high," he would say. Jonathan had laughed at it then, but now, standing in the darkened house, the words pressed against his ribs like an unseen hand. Shaking his head, he set his bag down in the living room and pulled the sheets from the furniture. Dust danced in the dim light as he worked, uncovering the worn leather couch and the wooden coffee table. His grandfather's pipe still rested in the ashtray, untouched. He checked his phone. No signal. Of course, the farmhouse was too far from town, isolated in its own world. Deciding to call it a night, he grabbed his flashlight and headed upstairs. The second floor was just as still, the hallway stretching into darkness. His old bedroom was on the left, the door slightly ajar. He hesitated before pushing it open. The room was eerily untouched. His childhood bed, the wooden dresser, the bookshelf filled with dust-covered novels, but something felt off. A heaviness lingered in the air, a quiet that pressed into his ears. Ignoring the unease, he set his flashlight on the nightstand and pulled off his jacket. As he lay down, the silence of the house wrapped around him. The wind rattled the windows, and somewhere in the distance a coyote howled. Sleep came reluctantly. Then something woke him, a soft creak. Jonathan's eyes shot open. The room was pitch black, the only sound his own breath. He reached for his flashlight, but his fingers fumbled against the empty nightstand. Another creak. Closer this time. His pulse quickened as he sat up, scanning the darkness. His flashlight lay on the floor near the door, as if it had been knocked off the table. Had he done that in his sleep? Then he heard it. A whisper. Low, almost imperceptible. His breath caught in his throat. It was coming from the hallway. Heart pounding. He swung his legs over the bed, feet touching the cold wooden floor. He hesitated before standing, the silence stretching unbearably. Slowly, he crept to the door and peered into the hallway. Empty. His grandfather's old study was at the end of the hall, the door slightly ajar. The memory hit him like a hammer. He had never been allowed inside. His grandfather had always kept it locked, but now it was open. A faint light flickered from within. Jonathan swallowed, every instinct screaming at him to go back to bed, to pretend he had heard nothing. But his feet moved forward, drawn by an unseen force. The floorboards groaned beneath his weight as he approached the door. The air was colder here. He reached for the doorknob. The moment his fingers brushed it, the whisper came again. This time it was right behind him. His blood ran cold. A breath of icy air ghosted across the back of his neck. Jonathan spun around, his heart hammering. No one. Just the dark hallway stretching behind him. His own breath was ragged, loud in the silence. Then from inside the study, a shadow moved. Jonathan barely had time to react before the door slammed shut in his face, a forceful, violent bang that rattled the walls. He stumbled back, pulse roaring in his ears. His flashlight flickered from the floor, casting erratic shadows. Then the whispers returned. Not one voice, but many. Layered, overlapping, low, desperate murmurs that seeped through the wood. Jonathan grabbed the doorknob, twisting hard, locked, a sudden sharp knock from inside. Then another. Slow, rhythmic. Jonathan backed away. The knocking grew louder, faster. Panic surged in his chest. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the noise stopped. Silence. The air was thick, oppressive. Then from behind the door, a single word. Leave. Jonathan didn't wait. He grabbed his flashlight and bolted down the stairs. his breath coming in short gasps. The house groaned around him, the air growing heavier with each step. As he reached the front door, he hesitated. A whisper slithered through the darkness. "Jonathan." His entire body went cold. It knew his name. Fighting the terror clawing at his throat, he yanked the door open and stumbled outside. The night air hit him like a slap, crisp and real. He sprinted to his truck, fumbling with the keys, his hands shaking. The engine roared to life. As he pulled away, he glanced in the rearview mirror. The house stood silent, but in the upstairs window where his grandfather's study had been, a figure stood watching. Jonathan didn't stop until he was miles away. The house was sold within the month. He never returned. But sometimes in the dead of night, when sleep eludes him, he swears he hears the whisper, calling his name. Story the end.
Story number 4.
The night was colder than usual for late October. The wind had a bite to it as it rattled the windows of the small roadside motel, making the old wooden frame creak and groan as if the building itself was alive. Jenna pulled the thin blanket tighter around her shoulders, glancing at the flickering lamp in the corner. The yellowed wallpaper seemed to breathe with every gust of wind outside. She had been driving for hours, too exhausted to make it to her destination. The motel had been the only place for miles, sitting alone on the side of the road like a forgotten relic. The sign out front had been half lit, buzzing and stuttering with weak neon letters that barely formed the word vacancy. There was no front desk, just an old man behind a sliding glass window who handed her a key with the number 6 scratched into it. Jenna had taken the room without question, too tired to care about the peeling paint, the old carpet that smelled of dust and mildew, or the heavy silence that filled the place. She just needed sleep. But something about the room felt wrong. It wasn't just the chill in the air or the dim glow of the buzzing lamp. It was something deeper, something she couldn't quite place. She had stayed in countless motels before, but this one felt different, uneasy. She set her phone on the nightstand, checking the time, 12:37 a.m. A noise. Soft. Barely there. Jenna sat up, listening. It came from the hallway, a shuffling sound like slow, dragging footsteps. She held her breath, waiting for them to pass, but they stopped. Right outside her door. Silence. Jenna's pulse quickened. Then, a knock. Soft, soft. Just one. She stared at the door. She wasn't expecting anyone. No one even knew she was here. Another knock. Louder this time. She swallowed hard, creeping out of bed and pressing her ear against the door. Nothing. Just silence and the sound of the wind outside. She hesitated before reaching for the doorknob. Something in her gut screamed, "Don't open it," but she had to look. She turned the knob slowly, just enough to crack the door open an inch. The hallway was empty. A single bulb flickered at the far end, casting long, twitching shadows across the stained carpet. No one was there. Jenna exhaled, shaking her head. Maybe she had imagined it. Maybe the exhaustion was getting to her. She shut the door, locking it this time. Then she heard it, the breathing, right behind her. Jenna spun around. Nothing. The room was empty. She felt it before she saw it. The shift in the air, the sudden drop in temperature. The lamp in the corner flickered. Then, a whisper. Low. Raspy. Right next to her ear. "Get out." Jenna's heart slammed against her ribs. She stumbled back, her breath coming in short gasps. The lamp went out. Darkness swallowed the room. She scrambled for her phone, her fingers shaking as she switched on the flashlight. The beam of light cut through the dark, landing on the mirror across the room. And she saw it, a figure, standing just behind her. A woman, gaunt, hollow-eyed, her mouth stretched too wide, her skin sickly pale. Jenna screamed. The reflection twisted, the figure's lips moving soundlessly. Then, the whisper came again. "You're in my room." Jenna ran. She didn't stop to grab her things. Didn't look back. She fumbled with the lock, yanked the door open, and sprinted down the hallway. The hallway stretched too long, the walls seeming to close in on her. The flickering light above buzzed and sparked. She reached the lobby, slamming her hand on the bell at the front desk. Nothing. The old man was gone. The glass window behind the desk was cracked, smeared with something dark. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she turned toward the exit, and froze. The front doors were gone, just a solid wall where they had been. She backed away, turning toward the hallway, and saw her, the woman, standing at the end of the corridor, watching, waiting. The light above her burned out, darkness swallowed everything. Then, a voice, Cold. Final. You should have left when I told you to. The last thing Jenna felt was the icy grip of fingers closing around her wrist. Then, nothing. The next morning, the motel was empty. The bed in room 6 was made. Jenna's car sat in the parking lot, untouched, and in the mirror, if you looked closely, you could see a new reflection. A woman, gaunt, hollow-eyed, watching, waiting. Story the end.
Story number 5.
The night was still. The kind of stillness that blankets everything like a thick, oppressive fog. The kind that makes every small noise feel louder, every shadow feel deeper. Ethan had been driving for hours, the road stretching before him like an endless ribbon of asphalt, winding through dense forests and fields. He had taken this route out of necessity, a shortcut, one that would save him at least an hour on the way home. The sign that marked the beginning of this lonely stretch of road, "Welcome to Hillside," had long faded from years of exposure to the elements. It was late past midnight, and Ethan had hoped to make it back to his apartment before the night grew any darker, but his car had begun to sputter about 20 minutes ago. First, it was just the engine cutting out for a second or two, and then it was the check engine light flashing angrily on the dashboard. Despite his best efforts to ignore it, the car had finally given up and coasted to a slow stop. Cursing, Ethan had pulled over to the side of the road and sat there for a moment, trying to gather his thoughts. There was no cell signal here, not out in the middle of nowhere, and he couldn't imagine walking for miles to the nearest town at this time of night. There was nothing for it. He would have to find a place to stay until morning. He checked his rearview mirror to see if there were any cars passing, but the road was empty. It had been empty the whole time, a reminder that this area of the countryside wasn't exactly bustling. He sighed and, for lack of a better idea, opened his door and stepped out into the cool air. The scent of pine trees and damp earth filled his nostrils as he walked toward the small, dilapidated building he had noticed a few miles back. It was a motel of sorts, but it looked as though it hadn't seen any visitors in years. The sign outside was barely legible, the neon letters flickering weakly in the dark. It wasn't a glamorous place, not by any stretch of the imagination, but at least it was somewhere to rest for the night. The moment he entered the office, a strange chill crept over him, even though the room wasn't particularly cold. The man behind the desk was old, so old, in fact, that he seemed almost as if he were made of the same dust as the room itself. He wore a gray cardigan and looked up at Ethan through half-lidded eyes, blinking as if the act of acknowledging him was a chore. "Can I help you?" the man croaked. His voice was raspy, like it hadn't been used in years. "I need a room for the night," Ethan said, trying to keep his voice steady, despite the eerie sensation creeping down his spine. The man slowly stood up from behind the desk, his joints creaking in protest, and shuffled to a small cabinet. "There's one room left," the old man said, grabbing a key that had the number scratched into it. "Room 5, just down the hall." Ethan didn't ask any questions. He wasn't in the mood for small talk, and frankly, he didn't feel like dealing with any oddities. It was late, and all he wanted was to sleep. He nodded his thanks, paid the man in cash, and made his way down the dimly lit hallway. Room 5 was at the very end, the door slightly ajar as if it had been waiting for him. Inside, the room was small, the furnishings ancient but functional. The bed was unmade, and the sheets looked like they hadn't been washed in a while, but that didn't bother Ethan. He was too tired to care. He dropped his bag onto the floor, closed the door behind him, and turned the lock. The light over the bed flickered for a moment before settling into a steady glow, casting long shadows on the walls. Ethan quickly stripped down to his shirt and jeans and flopped onto the bed, sinking into the surprisingly soft mattress. It was only he was about to close his eyes that he noticed the sound. At first, it was faint, a soft tapping, like the sound of some gently knocking against the wall. He frowned, sitting up and glancing around the room. Nothing. The room seemed to breathe with a low hum, as though it were alive in some strange, unnatural way. The sound continued, growing slightly louder, like a fingernail tapping against a wooden surface. Ethan shook his head, convinced it was just his imagination or the house settling. He turned over onto his side, burying his face in the pillow. But the tapping wouldn't stop. It seemed to come from the walls, from somewhere just beyond the thin veneer of plaster. His breath caught in his chest as the sound grew louder, sharper. A tap, 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 tap. He couldn't ignore it anymore. Ethan swung his legs off the bed and stood up, staring at the walls around him. The sound was no longer faint. It was unmistakable. Tap, tap, tap. Without thinking, he reached for the door handle and pulled it open. The hallway outside was as dark as ever, the only light coming from the dim bulb overhead. The room next to his, room 4, had a door slightly ajar as well. That's when he saw it. A shape. A figure. It was standing at the threshold of room 4, just out of view. A shadow that moved unnaturally, as though it were floating just above the floor. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as he froze, unable to look away. The figure seemed to sway, shifting from side to side as if beckoning him. It was pale, almost translucent, its features obscured in the gloom. Tap! 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 The sound was coming from room 4 now, louder and more insistent, like the scratching of nails against wood. The figure moved forward, its presence growing stronger, colder. Ethan felt an overwhelming urge to run, but his feet remained rooted to the floor. He couldn't breathe, couldn't look away. Just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure vanished, slipping into the darkness of the hallway. The sound stopped, and the air grew still once again. Ethan stumbled back into his room, slamming the door shut behind him. He locked it, his hands shaking. The silence that followed felt suffocating, the quiet too deep, too heavy. He sat on the bed, his mind racing. He couldn't explain what he had seen, no part of him wanted to. But the fear that had settled in his chest wouldn't go away. The night stretched on, and Ethan lay awake in the darkness, listening to the silence that had replaced the tapping. His eyes remained fixed on the door, afraid to blink, afraid to close his eyes for fear that the figure would return. But nothing came. The night passed slowly, as if time itself had been stretched thin. And finally, when the first light of dawn began to seep through the cracked blinds, Ethan finally allowed himself to close his eyes. Morning came with a strange sense of clarity. Ethan awoke to the sound of birds chirping outside, the normalcy of the day making the events of the previous night feel like a bad dream. But when he stepped into the hallway, there was no mistaking the unease that hung in the air. He walked down to the front desk where the old man sat in his usual position, staring out the window. "Checking out?" the man asked, barely looking up. "Yeah," Ethan replied, his voice shaky. I just wanted to ask. Room 4, is it?" The old man finally looked at him, his expression unreadable. "Room 4's been empty for a long time," he said, his voice flat. "No one stays there anymore." Ethan frowned, his heart racing. "Why not?" The man's gaze darkened. "Some things are better left alone." Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. He didn't ask any more questions. He paid for the night, grabbed his things, and left. As he stepped into his car and pulled away from the motel, he glanced in the rearview mirror, catching a glimpse of the building fading into the distance. For a moment, he swore he saw a shadow in the window of room 4, watching him as he drove away. He didn't look back. Story the end.
Story number 6.
It was late, around midnight, when I finally made my way down the long stretch of road that led to the old house. The streetlights flickered as if they couldn't keep up with the darkness that enveloped the night. I was already tired from the long drive, but there was something else, a nagging unease that settled deep in my chest, weighing me down with every mile. I hadn't been to the house in years, not since my aunt's passing. The house had been in the family for generations, but now it was mine. The family home, nestled at the edge of a small town, sat at the end of a narrow dirt road that was barely visible at night. The overgrown trees and the dense underbrush made it feel even more isolated than it already was. The house itself was old, weathered, with peeling paint and sagging gutters. To anyone passing by, it would have looked like just another forgotten property. But to me, it was home. As I pulled up the driveway, I could see the house silhouetted against the night sky, its shape jagged and imposing. The porch light flickered faintly, casting long, distorted shadows over the front yard. My headlights illuminated the front steps, but everything else seemed swallowed up by the inky blackness beyond. I hesitated for a moment, just long enough to hear the soft rustle of wind through the trees, before I switched off the engine and stepped out of the car. I had always been a bit uneasy about the house. Growing up, I used to visit my aunt there, and though it was always a place of comfort, there was something about it that never quite felt right. At night, when the house was silent, the floorboards creaked in the most peculiar ways, as though someone were walking through the halls. My aunt had always assured me it was just the house settling, that it had been around for far too long to be entirely quiet. But I had learned to ignore the strange sounds and never question them until now. I grabbed my bag from the passenger seat and walked up the creaky wooden steps. The front door opened with a soft groan as I pushed it open, the hinges protesting against the years of neglect. Stepping inside, the familiar scent of dust and old wood filled the air, but there was something else, something faintly metallic. My shoes echoed in the silence as I entered the living room, the floor creaking beneath my weight. The house felt alive, breathing in a way that made my skin crawl. I flicked on the light, but the bulb sputtered for a moment before it finally illuminated the room. The walls were lined with old photographs of my family, images of my grandparents, aunts, uncles, and cousins. Their smiling faces seemed almost too cheerful, too bright for the room's current state of decay. The furniture was draped in white sheets, as if someone had tried to preserve the house while it sat empty for so long. A grandfather clock in the corner ticked softly, its rhythmic sound oddly comforting in the otherwise eerie quiet. I dropped my bag on the floor and wandered further into the house, moving through the kitchen and into the hallway that led to the stairs. The stairs creaked under my weight as I ascended, each step groaning like the house itself was alive. At the top of the stairs, I hesitated, glancing down the long hallway that split the upper floor into two wings. The air felt heavier here, as though it had absorbed all the memories of those who had lived in the house before me. My aunt's room was at the end of the hall. The door was ajar, and I couldn't help but feel drawn to it. I had been in that room countless times as a child, but something about it seemed different now. The air was colder, and the faint smell of something floral mixed with the dust that had accumulated over the years. I pushed the door open, and the room was just as I remembered it, dark, quiet, with a single bed beneath a window that overlooked the yard. The curtains were drawn, casting everything in shadows, but there was something strange. The room felt too still, too empty. I stepped in, my footsteps soft against the floor, but even as I moved, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. My heart raced for no reason at all. It was as though the room itself was holding its breath. As I moved further into the room, my eyes were drawn to the rocking chair in the corner. My aunt had always kept it there next to the window, where she would sit in the evening and look out at the garden. The chair was still there, but something was wrong. It was moving, just slightly, as if someone had been sitting in it and had left it in motion. I stood frozen in place for a moment, watching the chair sway back and forth. It wasn't much, but the movement was unmistakable. A soft creak filled the air, followed by another gentle rock. My mouth went dry. I hadn't touched it. No one else had come into the room. I turned quickly, my back against the wall as I fumbled for the light switch. The moment I flipped the switch, the room was bathed in harsh, fluorescent light. The chair stopped moving immediately. The room felt suffocating now, the weight of the air pressing in on me, making it hard to breathe. I felt a cold shiver crawl down my spine. I shook my head, trying to convince myself it was just the house settling, the floorboards reacting to the changes in temperature. But the feeling didn't fade. It lingered, deep and unsettling. Something was wrong. I left the room quickly, my heart pounding, and closed the door behind me. As I turned to walk back down the hall, I noticed the family portrait hanging on the wall. The picture was of my grandmother and her siblings, taken years before I was born. They all looked so happy, so alive. But something caught my eye. One of them, my great-uncle, who had passed away many years ago, was standing just outside the frame, barely visible. His face was barely a shadow, but it was unmistakably him. I blinked, but when I looked again, the figure was gone. My stomach twisted. I hurried back downstairs and not wanting to linger any longer. The house was too quiet, too heavy. I needed to leave, but the sense of unease was too strong. I had to be imagining things. I couldn't let myself believe in ghosts, but as I walked toward the front door, I heard it. A faint whisper, barely audible, but it was there. "Help me." The voice sounded like it was coming from upstairs. My blood ran cold. I ran back up the stairs, my legs shaky beneath me. I reached the top, the whisper growing louder with each step until I was standing in the hallway again. It was coming from my aunt's room. I didn't know why, but I opened the door. The rocking chair was moving again, faster now, as though something or someone was sitting in it. I stepped into the room, my breath shallow, my pulse pounding in my ears. Then I saw it. In the corner near the window, a figure stood. It was translucent, faint, but unmistakably there. It was my aunt, or at least a shadow of her. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and filled with sadness, as though she were reaching out, asking for help. The room grew colder, the air thick with the weight of sorrow and loss. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. I was frozen, watching as the figure in the corner turned slowly toward me. It opened its mouth, but the sound that came from it wasn't words. It was a low, hollow cry of pain. Suddenly, the figure disappeared, vanishing into the darkness, and the room was silent again. I backed out of the room, my chest tight with fear. I couldn't stay here. I couldn't bear the weight of whatever had just happened. My mind raced as I rushed downstairs, grabbed my keys, and ran out of the house. I didn't look back. As I drove away, the house seemed to loom in my rearview mirror, its windows dark and empty, waiting. And though I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, I knew deep down that the house wasn't empty. It wasn't just the house settling. Something was still there, waiting. Story the end.
Story number 7.
It had been months since I had left the city. My work as a freelance writer had taken me to places I didn't expect to go, and when my aunt passed away unexpectedly, I found myself heading to the small, remote town in the middle of nowhere to handle her estate. The town was quiet, a place that seemed forgotten by time. My aunt had lived there for years in an old house on the outskirts of town, and now it was up to me to go through everything and figure out what to do with the property. When I arrived at the house, I wasn't sure what I expected. I had visited a few times during childhood, but it had been a while, and the place seemed different now, much quieter, more somber. The old farmhouse sat on a small patch of land surrounded by fields that stretched on for miles. The wind had a way of howling through the trees in the distance, making everything feel isolated and far removed from the world. I pulled my car into the gravel driveway, and as the tires crunched on the loose rocks, the house came into full view. It was a large 2-story home, painted white with peeling paint and an old wooden porch that sagged slightly. The windows were covered in a layer of dust, the blinds pulled down tightly, leaving the house feeling abandoned despite my presence. It was the kind of place that made you feel like you were being watched, even when you were alone. I stepped out of the car, the cool air hitting me as I grabbed my bag. The creaking of the porch as I approached made my stomach twist slightly, and the feeling of unease crept over me, but I pushed it aside. I hadn't come all this way just to turn around. My aunt had left everything to me, and there was no turning back now. The front door was unlocked, and it opened with an eerie groan as I stepped inside. The house smelled musty, like old wood and dust, the kind of smell you find in places left untouched for years. I flipped the light switch, but the bulb buzzed and flickered before giving out altogether. I sighed, but it was too late to head into town for more supplies. I grabbed the flashlight I had packed and began to explore. I moved from room to room, feeling the weight of the silence settle over me like a heavy blanket. The living room was covered with old furniture draped in white sheets, as if it had been prepared for some long-forgotten occasion. The air was stagnant, the smell of mildew clinging to everything. The house was cold, much colder than it should have been for a spring evening. The walls seemed to close in, and for the first time I felt a pang of doubt about staying here overnight. But I shook it off. I had to get this done. I was going to spend the night here, whether the house liked it or not. I ventured into the kitchen, where the old appliances still stood, covered in a thick layer of dust. The wood floors creaked with every step, and the shadows in the corners seemed to grow longer. I set my flashlight down on the counter and began going through the drawers, searching for anything that might be useful for the night ahead. It was hard to concentrate on anything with the feeling of being watched growing stronger with each passing minute. There was a sudden bang from upstairs. My heart lurched in my chest, and I immediately froze. I listened, straining to hear any sounds that followed. Nothing. The house was quiet once again, as if nothing had happened at all. I tried to convince myself it was just the house settling. It was an old place after all, and houses like this made noises, especially at night. But as I stood there, the hairs on the back of my neck began to stand on end, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was upstairs. It was foolish to be frightened, I told myself. I was just being paranoid. I decided to head upstairs. My footsteps were hesitant, each creak of the floorboards echoing louder in the stillness of the house. As I made my way up the stairs, the air grew colder, much colder than it should have been. It wasn't just the draft, it was a chill that seeped into my bones, a presence that made me feel like I wasn't alone. The second floor was just as quiet as the first, and the hallway was dark, with only the light from my flashlight to guide me. I glanced down the hallway where my aunt's bedroom door stood slightly ajar. The door was cracked open, just enough to let me see the shadows inside. I approached the door carefully, my breath coming faster as I tried to calm my nerves. I pushed the door open slowly. The room was exactly as I remembered it, with an old bed covered in quilts and a rocking chair by the window. It was eerily still. But then something caught my eye, a small movement in the corner of the room, near the rocking chair. I stopped, my heart racing. There was a figure sitting in the chair. The figure wasn't clear, not at first. It was shadowy, indistinct, but it was there. The air felt heavier as I stood frozen, unsure of what to do next. I blinked, and the figure was gone. My breath caught in my throat as I turned the flashlight around the room, but there was nothing. The chair was empty, just as it had been before. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the odd sensation that something was watching me. My imagination was getting the better of me. The house was old, full of drafts and creaking wood. It had been empty for a long time, but the unease lingered. I stepped back from the doorway, deciding I had had enough of exploring for the night. I made my way down the hall and back to the stairs. As I descended, I heard it again, the sound of footsteps above me, faint but unmistakable. My pulse quickened, and I felt a cold sweat break out on my skin. There was no way anyone could be up there. I was the only one in the house. But the footsteps grew louder, closer, and I couldn't ignore the gut-wrenching feeling that something or someone was just above me. I rushed down the stairs, trying not to let panic overtake me. But as I reached the bottom, a door slammed shut somewhere in the house. I jumped, my heart leaping into my throat. My hands trembled as I grabbed the flashlight and scanned the dark living room. The door to the basement was ajar, slightly open, just enough for me to see the blackness below. It hadn't been like that before. I had checked the door when I first arrived. Without thinking, I moved toward it. As I stood at the top of the basement stairs, I felt the temperature drop even further, the cold crawling over my skin. A noise came from below, a faint whispering, as though someone were calling my name. I hesitated. I didn't want to go down there, but the voice, soft and barely audible, continued, repeating my name over and over again. I felt drawn to it, as if something was beckoning me. I had to see what it was. I descended the stairs slowly, the beam of my flashlight dancing in the dark. The air was thick, and the further down I went, the more suffocating it became. The basement was even colder than the rest of the house. I reached the bottom, and as I turned to look around, my flashlight flickered and then went out. The darkness closed in, and I felt something move behind me. I spun around, but there was nothing. The whispering came again, this time louder, more urgent. It was coming from the far corner of the basement, near an old trunk that had been pushed against the wall. I couldn't see what it was, but the voice felt closer now, as if it was just on the other side of the darkness. I turned and ran, my feet pounding against the stairs as I hurried back upstairs and into the living room, gasping for air. The house was silent once again. I was alone. I couldn't stay here anymore. The fear that gripped me was overwhelming, and I knew I needed to leave, but when I reached the front door, it wouldn't open. Panic set in as I pulled on the doorknob, but it was locked from the inside. I turned, my flashlight scanning the room, and that's when I saw it. A shadow, standing just inside the doorway, watching me. I didn't hesitate. I ran to the back door, but it was locked too. I felt trapped. The shadow moved closer, and then I heard it, soft footsteps, as though someone was walking up behind me. I spun around, but the room was empty. The front door was wide open, and the night air rushed in, filling my lungs with cold relief. I didn't look back. I grabbed my keys, ran to my car, and drove off, not stopping until I was miles away. I never went back, and I never will. Story the end.
Story number 8.
The drive was long, and the night was growing colder by the minute. Jake had been on the road for hours, heading back from a business trip that had taken him deep into the countryside. The highway stretched endlessly in front of him, dark and deserted, with only the occasional flicker of his headlights illuminating the trees on either side of the road. He had passed a few small towns earlier in the evening, but now he was in the middle of nowhere. It had been a long day, and the sleepiness was starting to set in. He considered pulling off at the next exit to find somewhere to rest, but there hadn't been any signs of a motel for miles. He thought about driving through to the next town, but it was still a good 40 minutes away, and he didn't think he'd make it without falling asleep at the wheel. That's when he saw it. The small, rundown motel appeared like a ghost in the dark. Its flickering neon sign barely hanging on, the word vacancy flashing intermittently as if it was about to give up entirely. Jake slowed the car, scanning the parking lot. There were only a few cars parked outside. It didn't look like a luxurious place, but at this point, he didn't care. He just needed to sleep. Pulling into the lot, he noticed the faded paint on the walls, the crumbling steps leading up to each room, and the heavy air that seemed to cling to everything. There was a strange, almost unnerving stillness in the air. He shook his head, telling himself it was just his tired mind playing tricks. He parked his car and walked inside the small office. The smell of stale cigarettes and old furniture hit him as he stepped through the door. The man behind the counter looked up slowly, as if it took him a moment to notice someone had entered. His hair was thinning, his face weathered with age. He was hunched over a newspaper, his hands shaking slightly. "Can I help you?" The man's voice was hoarse, as if he hadn't spoken in days. "I need a room for the night," Jake replied. The man stared at him for a moment, blinking slowly before reaching under the counter and grabbing a key. The number on the key tag was 12. He slid it across the counter without a word, his gaze never leaving Jake's face. "Thanks," Jake said, taking the key and turning toward the door. The man nodded, his eyes still fixed on him. Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, but he shrugged it off. He was tired, and he had to be up early for work. The room wasn't much better than the exterior of the motel. Old furniture, a bed with a sagging mattress, and a single light bulb that hung from the ceiling, casting an eerie glow. The air inside was thick with the smell of dust and mildew. He tossed his bag on the bed and locked the door behind him. He would get some sleep and leave early in the morning. But as he lay there, trying to drift off, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It was a sensation that crept up on him, a chill crawling down his spine. He glanced at the window, but the blinds were drawn. The room was too quiet. He tried to ignore it, but the feeling lingered. It wasn't just the silence. It was the way the room felt. Heavy. As if the walls were pressing in and closing him off from the rest of the world. The shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally, making the room feel even smaller. The longer he lay there, the more restless he became. Jake sat up, looking around the room. There was no reason for him to feel this way. He was just tired. Then he heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible sound like footsteps in the hallway. He froze, listening intently. The footsteps stopped just outside his door. He held his breath. Nothing. He waited, expecting the sound to continue, but it was gone. For a moment, he convinced himself it was just the house settling. The building was old, but the silence that followed was even more unsettling. He stood up, walked to the door, and peered through the peephole. The hallway was empty. Relieved, he stepped back from the door, running his hand through his hair. Maybe he had imagined it. But as he turned to go back to bed, he saw something in the corner of the room. At first, it was just a shadow, but as his eyes adjusted to the dim light, he could make out a figure standing in the corner of the room. It was a woman. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and staring, though unblinking. She was dressed in an old-fashioned nightgown, the fabric tattered and yellowed with age. Her long hair hung loosely around her shoulders, and her hands were clasped in front of her, as if she were waiting for him to speak. Jake's heart pounded in his chest as he froze in place. His mind raced, but he couldn't form a coherent thought. Was it real? Was it just his tired mind playing tricks? He took a hesitant step forward. The woman didn't move. Her gaze never left him. "Who are you?" Jake asked, his voice barely a whisper. There was no answer. The woman's expression remained blank, her eyes wide with an intensity that sent a shiver through his spine. He took another step closer, and that's when he saw it. The skin around her neck was bruised, dark, and swollen as if she had been strangled. The realization hit him like a wave. Suddenly, the room felt much colder, and the shadows in the corner seemed to grow, stretching toward him like hands reaching out of the darkness. Jake's heart raced. He turned and stumbled back toward the door, his hands shaking as he fumbled for the handle. But before he could open it, he heard the woman's voice, soft and faint. "Help me." The words sent a jolt of panic through his body. He slammed his hand against the door, desperate to escape, but it wouldn't budge. It was as if the door had sealed itself shut. "Please," the woman whispered again. "Help me." Jake's breath came in short gasps. His eyes darted around the room, but the woman was gone. The shadows were still there, but the figure had vanished. He ran to the window, pulling at the blinds, but the window wouldn't open either. He was trapped. Then, the tapping began. It was soft at first, just like before, a light, rhythmic tapping on the window like fingernails against glass. But as the seconds ticked by, the tapping grew louder. The sound echoed through the room, filling it with an unbearable tension. Jake spun around, his back pressed against the window. He was trapped, nowhere to run. The woman reappeared, her face now contorted in agony. Her eyes seemed to bulge from her face, and her hands were stretched toward him, head of her own, pleading. "Please," she begged, her voice now a raspy whisper. "Help me." Jake's chest tightened, his breath shallow. The air in the room felt thick, suffocating, and he could feel the weight of her presence pressing down on him. He couldn't move. He couldn't speak. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped. The tapping ceased. The woman vanished. The room grew still again, as if nothing had happened. Jake's mind was spinning, his body was frozen, locked in place, unable to comprehend what he had just witnessed. Was it real? Was he dreaming? He tried the door again. This time, it opened without resistance. He stepped out into the hallway, but the motel was silent. There was no sign of the woman, no sign of anything unusual. He didn't stop to question it. He grabbed his things and fled, running out into the cold night air. He didn't look back. He never returned to that motel. In fact, he couldn't even remember the name of it. But sometimes, late at night, when the air is still and the world feels too quiet, he can still hear the soft tapping of fingernails on glass, and he knows the woman is still waiting. Story the end.
Story number 9.
I had never believed in ghosts, at least not in any tangible sense. Sure, I had heard the stories, the ones passed around by friends, the family legends, the ones that seemed to take on a life of their own with every retelling. But I was logical, grounded in reality. Nothing had ever convinced me otherwise, and so I remained skeptical. That was until the night I moved into the house at the edge of town. It was an old place, the kind that looked like it belonged in a ghost story, with a tall, narrow structure and ivy creeping up the sides. The kind of house that had been standing for longer than anyone could remember. It had a certain charm, yes, but also something unsettling about it, as though it was waiting for something or someone. When I found out that I was being given the house, I didn't hesitate. It was a small inheritance from an uncle I'd barely known, and I was grateful for the opportunity. The idea of a quiet, private space to call my own, away from the hustle and bustle of the city, felt like a dream come true. The house had been vacant for years, but the idea of living somewhere with a little history intrigued me. I thought I would enjoy the peace and solitude. The first few days were uneventful. The house was dusty, but that was to be expected. I spent my time cleaning, unpacking, and adjusting to my new life. It was a simple routine, and then, on the fourth night, everything changed. It was late, far past midnight when I first heard it. At first, I thought it was the wind. An old house like this, full of creaky floors and aging beams, would make strange noises, especially at night. But when the sound came again, this time closer, sharper, it froze me in place. It was a soft, almost imperceptible tapping. It sounded like fingernails against wood. I sat up in bed, listening intently. The tap came again, this time from somewhere downstairs, just beyond the hallway. My mind raced through all the possibilities. An animal, the house settling, but the thought that lingered in the back of my mind was the one I tried to ignore. Something, or someone, was in the house with me. I lay in bed for what felt like an eternity, the silence stretching on until the clock beside me ticked another few minutes into the night. I finally mustered the courage to get up, telling myself it was nothing. It had to be nothing. It was just an old house. I grabbed my flashlight, my heart pounding in my chest as I made my way downstairs. The air grew colder as I descended, and my breath came in visible puffs. The hall was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the moon through the windows. The sound had stopped, and the silence was almost deafening. I crept toward the living room, every step cautious, as if not to disturb whatever was hiding in the dark. The beam of my flashlight flickered, casting erratic shadows across the walls. My hands were trembling, and my pulse thundered in my ears. I reached the doorway and stopped. There was nothing. No tapping. No movement. Just the empty room. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding and turned to leave. But then, something caught my eye. The chair. It was facing the window, just as it had been when I'd last left the room. But now, it wasn't. It was turned, angled slightly as though someone had been sitting in it just moments ago. My stomach twisted and the flashlight slipped from my hand, clattering onto the floor. I froze, my eyes locked on the chair. It hadn't been moved when I had last seen it. The chair had been perfectly still, a part of the static room. I bent down, my fingers brushing against the cold wooden floor to pick up the flashlight, but the sudden movement brought the feeling of eyes on me. I couldn't explain it, but the room felt different now. The air was thick, pressing down on me as though I was intruding. The shadows seemed to stretch farther, too long for the size of the room. Then a sound, a soft creak from above. I jerked my head upward toward the staircase. The house was silent again, but that sound, slow, deliberate, as though something heavy was being dragged across the floor above me, sent a chill down my spine. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. The idea of going upstairs filled me with dread, but there was no escaping it. I had to know what was making that sound. I moved toward the staircase, the floorboards groaning under my weight. I couldn't help but feel that whatever it was waiting for me. I gripped the railing as I ascended the stairs, every step loud in the stillness, as if announcing my presence to whatever was in the house with me. When I reached the top of the stairs, the house seemed even quieter. My flashlight barely illuminated the darkness in front of me. The hallway stretched on before me, its length obscured by shadows. I turned the corner, heading for the bedroom at the end of the hall, but then I heard it again. The sound. It came from the farthest room, a low, scraping sound that sent my blood running cold. I was drawn toward it, unable to resist the pull of whatever it was. Each step felt like an eternity. My breath was shallow as I approached the door, which stood slightly ajar. I pushed it open, my heart hammering in my chest. The room was empty. The bed was neatly made, the curtains drawn tightly across the window. But then, as my flashlight swept across the room, I saw it. A figure standing in the corner, just barely visible in the dim light. It was a woman, or at least it looked like a woman. She was tall, her long hair falling in loose waves around her shoulders. She wore a dress, an old-fashioned one, as the kind that looked like it belonged in another time, another century. Her face was pale, her features soft but somehow distant, like she was a memory of something long past. She didn't move. She didn't blink. She just stood there, staring at me with eyes that seemed to pierce through the darkness. I couldn't breathe. My legs refused to move. I just stood there, frozen, staring at her, trying to convince myself it was just my mind playing tricks. But it wasn't. I knew it wasn't. The woman's lips parted slightly, and then the room filled with a soft whisper. "Help me." The words were barely a breath, but they were clear. They were for me. The cold that washed over me then was unbearable, and I stumbled backwards, slamming into the doorframe. My heart pounded in my ears, and my breath came in ragged gasps as I scrambled backward toward the stairs. The woman didn't follow. She remained in the corner, her gaze never leaving me. I reached the stairs and ran down them, not looking back, my body shaking uncontrollably. I didn't stop until I was outside, my feet hitting the grass beneath me, the air thick and suffocating with the night. The moon hung high in the sky, but I couldn't feel its light. All I could feel was the fear, the cold, overwhelming fear that had overtaken me. I sat there in the yard, panting, trying to steady my breath, trying to process what had just happened. I didn't know what I had seen or what I had heard, but I knew one thing for certain. The house wasn't empty. Not by a long shot. That night, I didn't sleep. I couldn't. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind seemed to carry the weight of something unseen, something waiting. The next morning, I packed my things, determined to leave. I couldn't stay there, not after what I had seen. I didn't know what that woman wanted or why she had appeared, but I knew I couldn't face her again. I haven't returned to the house since that night. I don't know if it still stands or if the woman is still there, waiting. But I do know one thing. There are things in this world that we can't explain, and sometimes the things we fear the most aren't things at all. They're memories. Story the end.
Story number 10.
The wind howled outside, rattling the windows of the old farmhouse I had inherited. I wasn't sure why I had agreed to move into this place. Maybe it was the allure of something new or just the fact that I needed a change. Either way, I found myself standing in the kitchen, the creaky floorboards beneath my feet, staring out into the darkness of the fields that surrounded the house. The farm had been in my family for generations, passed down from my great-grandparents to my grandparents and then to my parents. But after my parents' sudden passing, I was the one left to handle it all. I wasn't unfamiliar with the house. I had spent countless summers here as a child, running around the fields, playing in the barn, exploring the surrounding woods. But that was when everything seemed full of life, full of promise. Now, in the dead of winter, the house seemed to have a strange kind of emptiness, like it was waiting for something. Or maybe it was just me, overthinking everything in the stillness of the night. The house was old, like I said, and everything creaked and groaned. The walls were thin, the pipes often making strange noises, and the floors had that signature squeak whenever you walked across them. But tonight, as I settled into my new home, those sounds seemed amplified, as though the house itself was trying to tell me something. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something else here. Something just beyond my awareness, lurking in the shadows, waiting. I tried to ignore the creeping sensation and made myself a cup of tea, trying to calm my nerves. The house was cold, despite the fireplace crackling softly in the living room. I'd always loved the warmth it provided, but tonight it didn't seem to be enough. It was as if the cold air was coming from somewhere deep within the house, like it was emanating from the very walls. Sipping my tea, I moved toward the hallway, my mind wandering back to my childhood. My parents used to tell me stories about the house, stories of strange occurrences, whispers in the night, shadows that moved when no one was there. I had always dismissed them as just that, stories. But now, in the silence of the house, I couldn't help but feel that maybe, just maybe, they were more than stories. I made my way to the staircase, the narrow hallway stretching out before me, bathed in the soft light of the lamps I had turned on. I had always loved the old staircase, the banister worn smooth from years of use. As a child, I would race up and down, pretending to be a knight saving the princess, or an explorer on a grand adventure. Now it felt like a path leading me into the unknown. I hesitated for a moment at the base of the stairs. The house was so quiet, too quiet. I listened, straining to hear any sound, but all I could hear was the beating of my own heart in my ears. No footsteps, no whispers, just silence. Shaking off the unease, I climbed the stairs, my hand gripping the banister as I made my way to the second floor. The upstairs was just as I remembered it, dimly lit, with old wooden floors creaking beneath my feet. My parents' old bedroom was the first door on the left, and across from it, my own childhood room, though now it seemed smaller, more cramped than I remembered. I stood there for a moment, staring at the door to my old room. I hadn't intended to go inside. It felt wrong somehow, like opening it would bring something back. But the curiosity got the better of me. I turned the handle and stepped inside. The room was just as it had been. The faded wallpaper peeling slightly in the corners, the wooden floors dark with age. I ran my fingers along the old desk where I used to do my homework, and the bed that had once been my sanctuary now seemed small, like a relic of a time long gone. The room was cold, and as I stood there, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching me. I turned quickly, but no one was there. The feeling, however, didn't go away. I shook my head, trying to convince myself that it was just my imagination. I didn't believe in ghosts, not really. The stories my parents used to tell were just that, stories. Yet, as I stood in the room, I couldn't help but feel a strange pull, as if the room itself was calling to me. The wind outside howled again, louder this time, and I jumped, startled by the sudden noise. The shutters on the window rattled, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw something move in the corner of my eye. But when I looked, there was nothing. The room was empty. I took a deep breath and left the room, closing the door behind me. As I turned to leave the hallway, I heard it, a faint sound, almost like a whisper, coming from my parents' bedroom. My heart skipped a beat. I paused, unsure whether to investigate or leave it alone. But the curiosity was too strong, and I found myself walking toward the door. I pushed it open slowly, the hinges creaking with the movement. The room was dark, the only light coming from the streetlights outside filtering through the curtains. The bed was untouched, the furniture arranged just as it had always been. But the air in the room felt different, heavy, thick with something I couldn't quite place. I stepped inside, and as soon as I did, the door slammed shut behind me, causing me to jump. I whirled around, my pulse racing, but the door was still closed, and there was no wind to explain it. The house was old, and the doors often closed on their own, but this felt different. It felt deliberate. I reached for the light switch, but when I flicked it, nothing happened. The light bulb was out, just like the one in the hallway downstairs. I cursed under my breath, reaching into my pocket for my phone to use its flashlight. As I illuminated the room, I noticed something on the floor near the bed, a single, old photograph, face down. I crouched down to pick it up, and when I flipped it over, I froze. It was a picture of my parents, taken long before I was born. But what struck me was the date scrawled on the back, 1978. The photograph had been taken when they were much younger, before they had ever moved into the house. I hadn't even known they had a picture like this. They'd never mentioned it to me. The strange part was that there was something off about it, something that I couldn't put my finger on. I stood up, the photo still in my hand, when I heard a faint scratching sound like fingernails against wood. It came from behind me, from the far corner of the room. I turned, expecting to see the shadows of furniture or an old piece of wood shifting, but instead, I saw a shape. A shadow that was darker than the rest of the room. It was humanoid in form, but not quite right. It was tall, and its edges seemed to blur, as if it was barely holding itself together. My breath caught in my throat, and I felt a chill creep down my spine. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. The shadow seemed to sway toward me, its presence filling the room, its energy oppressive and cold. I could feel my heart racing, my palms slick with sweat, and yet I couldn't tear my eyes away from the shape. The scratching sound continued, growing louder, as if the figure was getting closer. And then it stopped. A voice, a whisper, barely audible, but unmistakable. Leave. I didn't need to be told twice. I dropped the photograph and bolted toward the door, my heart pounding in my chest. I fumbled with the handle, my hands shaking, before finally wrenching the door open. I stumbled into the hallway, gasping for air. I didn't stop running until I reached the bottom of the stairs. My legs were weak and my mind was racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I stood in the living room, my chest heaving, the house eerily silent again. I don't know what I saw that night. I don't know if it was my imagination running wild or if the house truly was haunted. But one thing I do know is that after that night, I never felt the same about the house. I left the next morning, unable to stay another night in that place. The photo, the shadow, the voice, it was all too much. To this day, I don't know what it was, but I never went back to that house. I don't think I ever will. Story, the end.
Story number 11.
I don't really believe in ghosts or spirits, at least I didn't before that night. I had always dismissed those kinds of things as products of imagination or just bad experiences, things that could be explained away with science or logic. But one night, in a small town I'd never heard of before, I was forced to reconsider everything I thought I knew. It started innocently enough. I had been driving across the country heading to a new job in the city. I'd planned to stay at a few motels along the way, each one a quick stop to rest before getting back on the road. By the time I reached the outskirts of this particular town, it was nearly midnight. The road was empty, and the headlights of my car illuminated only the dark asphalt and the occasional flicker of a distant streetlight. I had been on the road for hours and was in desperate need of a break. It wasn't that I hadn't driven through small towns before, but this one felt different. There was a certain heaviness to the air, a sort of weight that seemed to press down on everything. As I drove deeper into the town, I noticed that the buildings were aging, worn down with time. The streets were empty, no sign of life at all. A few streetlights buzzed in the silence, casting an eerie glow over the deserted streets. I pulled up to a small motel on the edge of town. The neon sign flickered weakly, but it was still enough to catch my attention. Vacancy, it read. It wasn't fancy, certainly not the type of place I'd normally stay, but I was tired and there didn't appear to be any other options around. I figured I could rest here for the night and continue my drive in the morning. I walked into the office. The air inside was musty, filled with the scent of old wood and something faintly metallic. The man behind the desk barely looked up as I entered. His face was tired, drawn with deep lines beneath his eyes. He didn't speak at first, just stared at me for a long moment before finally breaking the silence. "You need a room?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly. I nodded, and he gave me a key to room 9. He didn't offer anything else. No smile, no small talk. Just a silent handout of the key and a grunt of acknowledgement. Something about the whole interaction unsettled me, but I brushed it off as the man simply being tired. The room itself was dimly lit, with peeling wallpaper and a musty smell. It wasn't the kind of place I would have chosen under normal circumstances, but at that hour, I couldn't be picky. I dropped my bags on the bed and began to unwind, glad to have a few hours of rest before hitting the road again. I locked the door behind me, pulled the curtains shut, and tried to make myself comfortable. But the longer I sat in the room, the more unsettled I felt. The quiet was oppressive. It wasn't the normal kind of quiet. This was the kind that pressed in on you, like the walls were closing in. I tried to distract myself by flipping through TV channels, but the screen was fuzzy and there were no real shows on. Just static and a few old, grainy movies that had long since passed their expiration date. I stood up and stretched, the silence still thick in the air. That's when I heard it. A sound, soft at first, like a light tapping. It came from the wall near the head of the bed. I paused, listening. The sound was faint, almost imperceptible, but definitely there. It was a light tap, 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 rhythmic and consistent. I looked at the wall, half expecting to see something, perhaps a pipe or a wire shifting under the weight of the house settling, but nothing. The room was still. I chalked it up to the old building and tried to ignore it, but the sound continued. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from the wall again, louder this time. I stood and moved closer to the wall, pressing my ear against it. For a few seconds, there was nothing, just the low hum of the old refrigerator in the corner. Then, suddenly, the tapping resumed. It was more insistent now, like something or someone was trying to get my attention. I backed away from the wall, feeling uneasy. It couldn't be anything serious, just a noise in an old building. That's all. But my mind wasn't so easily convinced. I turned around, pacing in the small space, trying to push the thought out of my head. But it wasn't easy to ignore the feeling of something or someone watching me. I sat back down on the bed and tried to get some sleep. But every time I closed my eyes, the tapping started again. Tap, tap, tap. It was as though it was coming from all directions now. Not just the wall near the bed, but the ceiling, the floor, even the door. I tried to convince myself it was just the house settling, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The next thing I remember, I was jolted awake. My heart was racing, and for a few seconds I had no idea where I was. Then I heard it again, the tapping. This time it was louder and more frantic, as though it was right outside the door. I lay still, frozen, my breath shallow. The tap, tap, tap came in quick succession, faster now, as though someone was knocking on the door with an urgent rhythm. I forced myself to move, standing up and walking toward the door. My hand hovered over the doorknob, but I couldn't bring myself to open it. The fear was overwhelming, and I didn't know what I'd find on the other side. I backed away from the door and glanced toward the window. The curtains were still drawn, the faint light from the street lamp outside casting long shadows across the room. The room felt colder now, a biting chill in the air that hadn't been there before. I couldn't stay in that room any longer. I grabbed my bags, rushed toward the door, and flung it open. I didn't care about being quiet anymore. I needed to get out. The hallway outside was eerily quiet, and the motel was still. The man at the front desk wasn't in sight, and the air felt thick with silence. I glanced down the hallway toward the exit, and that's when I saw it. A figure, standing at the far end of the corridor. It was a woman, dressed in an old-fashioned nightgown. Her face was pale, and her long black hair fell in tangled waves around her shoulders. She didn't move, just stood there in the darkness, staring at me with wide, unblinking eyes. My blood ran cold. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I wanted to run, but my feet wouldn't move. I felt like I was trapped in place, unable to look away from her. Then, as if sensing my fear, the woman slowly began to move toward me, her feet gliding across the floor as though she were floating. She didn't make a sound, her movement almost hypnotic in its slowness. My heart raced in my chest, and every instinct told me to flee, but I was paralyzed, unable to tear my eyes away from the figure. She stopped a few feet away, just outside the reach of the dim light. Her lips parted, and she whispered something, words I couldn't make out. The air in the hallway grew colder, and the shadows seemed to deepen. And then, just as suddenly as she had appeared, the woman vanished into thin air, leaving only the cold emptiness of the hallway behind. I don't remember what happened after that. I must have stumbled back to my room, but everything after that moment is a blur. I don't remember checking out of the motel, don't remember getting in my car and driving away. All I remember is the feeling of dread that followed me for days. The image of that woman's unblinking eyes burned into my mind. When I returned home, I tried to tell myself that it was just a nightmare, something my mind had conjured after a long day of driving. But I know what I saw, I know what I felt, and to this day I can't shake the feeling that something followed me from that motel. Something I still don't understand. I haven't driven through that town since, and I've never been able to forget the woman in the nightgown. Story the end.
Story number 12.
The wind howled through the trees, and the small town of Elms Hollow seemed to hold its breath as the night stretched on. For Claire, the drive had been long, and she was grateful to finally be nearing the town she'd heard so much about. She had grown up not far from here, but had left for college, and life had taken her far from home. Yet, now, here she was, returning to visit her aging grandmother. She had planned to drive straight through to the house, but the late hour and the encroaching fog made her reconsider. The road was twisting, darkened by the dense trees on either side, and Claire's headlights barely cut through the thick mist. She wasn't even sure if she was still on the main road. The phone signal was long gone, and there were no other cars in sight. As she pressed forward, Claire spotted a small motel in the distance. It looked almost out of place, the kind of run-down roadside establishment she'd expect to see in a horror movie. The neon sign flickered weakly, casting an eerie, inconsistent glow over the lot. The tall trees around it only added to the isolation of the place. But she was exhausted, and this was the only building in sight. She pulled into the lot, hoping to get some rest before heading out again in the morning. The door of the motel office creaked as Claire entered, and the smell of stale air hit her immediately. A man sat behind the counter, hunched over a newspaper. He didn't look up at first, and Claire hesitated, wondering if the place was even open. After a moment, the man looked up, his face gaunt and tired, and gave her a quick nod. "Room for the night?" he asked. Claire nodded, her voice soft. "Just for tonight." He slid the key to room 3 across the counter. "That'll be $40. The price seemed too cheap, considering how isolated the place was, but Claire wasn't about to argue. She paid the man and walked back out to her car. The key tag had the number 3 on it, and as she made her way to the room, she noticed that the parking lot was nearly empty, with only one other car parked at the far end. The air was cold, and the fog was creeping closer, swallowing the motel in a thick white haze. The room was even smaller than she'd anticipated, with a single bed, a small desk, and a television that didn't seem to work. The wallpaper was peeling, the floor cracked in a few places, and there was a strange, musty smell that she couldn't place. Claire sighed and dropped her bags onto the bed. The exhaustion from her drive hit her all at once. She locked the door behind her and made sure the curtains were drawn tightly. After a quick shower, Claire lay on the bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to shake the odd sense of unease that had settled over her. She had been driving for so long, and now that she was finally here, she was more tired than she'd realized. The room was cold despite the heater running, and the noise of the wind outside only added to her discomfort. She turned off the light, hoping the darkness would help her sleep, but the quiet only seemed to make the shadows in the room feel larger. As her eyes adjusted to the dark, she noticed something that made her skin crawl. There was a faint shape in the corner of the room, just beyond the edge of the bed. She blinked, wondering if she was seeing things. The shape was dark, indistinct, like a shadow, but it seemed almost wrong. It was as if the darkness had taken a shape of its own. Claire's heart began to race as she lay perfectly still, staring at the corner of the room. The longer she watched, the more it seemed to grow. The shape began to take on the form of a figure, tall and unnaturally thin, its outline shifting like smoke, moving closer to her side of the bed. Her breath hitched, and she quickly sat up, turning her eyes away from the corner. She shook her head, telling herself it was nothing, that her mind was just playing tricks on her due to the exhaustion. She reached over to the nightstand and fumbled for the lamp, flicking it on. The room lit up instantly, and the shape was gone. But the air felt heavier, as if something was still there, just beyond her sight. Claire stared at the corner for a long time, her body tense and ready to bolt, but the room was empty. There was no sign of anything out of the ordinary. She let out a shaky breath and decided to try again to get some rest. But as soon as she lay back down, the sound came. It was a soft scratching, like nails dragging across the wall. Claire's eyes snapped open, her heart pounding. The scratching came again, louder this time, followed by a faint whisper. She sat up, her pulse racing as she listened intently. The sound was coming from the wall just beside the bed, the exact spot where she had seen the shadow. She reached for her phone, wanting to call the front desk, but there was no signal. The scratching grew more frantic, now accompanied by a voice. Soft, almost unintelligible, but undeniably there. The whispering grew louder, and Claire could make out a few words. "Help me. Get out." The voice sounded desperate, and Claire's stomach turned. She quickly got out of bed and rushed to the door, checking the lock once more. It was secure, but the whispering didn't stop. It was as if the room was closing in on her, the walls pressing in with every passing second. She didn't know what to do, her mind racing for an explanation that made sense, but nothing could quell the rising panic. The sound stopped suddenly, and for a moment the room fell silent again. Claire stood frozen in place, her breath shallow. She didn't want to turn around, didn't want to see if the figure had returned, but she had no choice. Slowly she turned, her eyes scanning the dark corner of the room. This time, the shape was clearer. A figure of a woman, her face pale and gaunt, hair matted to her face, standing just a few feet away from the bed. Her eyes were hollow, black as night, and they stared directly into Claire's. The woman didn't move. She didn't speak. She just watched, and the weight of her gaze made Claire's blood run cold. Claire's hands trembled as she reached for the door, but the moment her fingers touched the handle, the woman spoke again, her voice raspy, strained. "Leave this place, before it's too late." The words sent a shiver through Claire's spine, and before she could react, the lights flickered, plunging the room into darkness once again. She stood there, her heart pounding in her chest, unable to move or think clearly. The only sound was the wind outside, howling like a distant scream. The moment seemed to stretch on for an eternity, the oppressive silence pressing in around her. But then, just as quickly as it had come, the lights came back on. The woman was gone. The room was empty. Claire stood frozen, trying to make sense of what had just happened, but there was no time to think. Something deep inside her told her she had to leave, that whatever was in that room, whatever that woman was, wasn't something to ignore. With trembling hands, Claire opened the door and stepped into the hallway. The motel was still silent, but the air was thick with a sense of dread that she couldn't shake. She didn't know where she was going, but she had to get out. The next morning, Claire was gone. The door to room 3 was left ajar, the key still hanging from the hook. The man at the front desk had never seen her leave. No one in the town of Elms Hollow ever spoke of her again. Some say she made it out and left without a trace. Others believe she became another lost soul, just like the woman who had warned her. To this day, if you pass through Elms Hollow and stop at the old motel, you'll see the same flickering sign. But no one stays there anymore. Story, the end.
Story number 13.
I had always thought of myself as a practical person. Skeptical, logical, and somewhat dismissive of anything supernatural. I'd grown up in a small, tight-knit town where everyone knew everyone else's business. And the kind of ghost stories that got passed around were always laughed off as exaggerated, overactive imaginations at best, or simple local myths at worst. So when I inherited my grandmother's house, an old 2-story cottage at the edge of town, I wasn't particularly worried. I wasn't the type to be haunted by childhood tales of ghostly apparitions or mysterious sounds from the attic. I had visited the house many times as a child, during summers and holidays. It was always full of warmth, laughter, and the smell of my grandmother's famous apple pie. She had been the sort of person who made everything feel safe and inviting, and even though the house was old, it was always filled with love. I never thought twice about it then. But after my grandmother passed away, I became the heir to the house, and the burden of upkeep fell to me. The house itself was beautiful in a quiet, melancholic way. It was one of those old cottages with creaky floorboards, a narrow staircase, and windows that had been painted over so many times they almost seemed to have a life of their own. It was surrounded by trees that shaded the property, their branches swaying in the wind. The yard was overgrown with ivy, and the garden, once my grandmother's pride, was now a chaotic jungle of weeds and forgotten flowers. But it was still a house I had a deep connection to, so I decided to move in and make it my own. The first few days were uneventful. I cleaned out the house, sorted through my grandmother's belongings, and slowly made the space livable again. But as the sun dipped below the horizon each night, the house began to feel different. It wasn't a drastic change, not something you could easily point to and say, that's what's wrong, but it was there nonetheless. A subtle shift in the air, a feeling that something was watching, something just out of sight. But I brushed it off. It was just the quiet, the loneliness, the unfamiliarity of being in a house that had once been filled with so much life. It wasn't until the second week that things started to get truly unsettling. I was in the living room, organizing bookshelves when I heard the sound, a soft, almost imperceptible scratching, like fingernails against wood. It wasn't the kind of noise that would immediately raise alarm. It was so faint, so distant, that it could have been the wind, or perhaps the house settling, I thought. But the scratching persisted, growing louder, more insistent. I froze, listening intently, my heart starting to race. It was coming from the attic. I had been up there once, shortly after moving in, to check on the old boxes my grandmother had left behind. There was nothing remarkable about the attic, just some old furniture, dusty trunks, and a few items that had been packed away for years. But now, as the scratching continued, I couldn't help but feel an odd unease. I stood there in the living room for what felt like an eternity, the sounds still echoing in my ears. Eventually, I shook myself out of my stupor. I couldn't keep standing there, frozen in fear. The attic was probably just full of mice or some other critters. I grabbed a broom, ready to confront whatever animal might be causing the noise, and made my way to the stairs. The attic door was at the end of a narrow hallway, a door that had always creaked in the most unsettling way when opened. As I approached it, the scratching stopped, leaving an almost unbearable silence in its wake. I stood there for a moment, my hand hovering over the doorknob, wondering if I was being foolish. But the need to know, to dispel whatever irrational fear had taken hold of me, won out. I twisted the knob and opened the door. The attic was dimly lit by the soft glow of daylight filtering through a small window at the far end. Dust particles danced in the light and the room smelled musty, like old books and forgotten memories. There were trunks stacked in the corner, boxes piled high, and a few pieces of old furniture draped in white sheets. It was just as I remembered it, ordinary and undisturbed. The silence now felt almost oppressive, as if the house itself was holding its breath. I stepped inside cautiously, scanning the room for any sign of movement. There was nothing. The scratching noise had stopped, and the attic was as still as a tomb. I walked over to the far corner where the boxes were stacked, and after a moment's hesitation, I began rummaging through them, trying to find the source of the noise, but all I found was dust, old newspapers, and my grandmother's trinkets. Nothing out of the ordinary. As I turned to leave, I heard it again. The scratching. This time it was closer, coming from behind one of the old furniture pieces draped in a sheet. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze in place, my mind racing. It was as though something was waiting for me to discover it. I slowly walked toward the object, my breath shallow and uneven. As I reached out to lift the sheet, I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I pulled the sheet off, my hands trembling, and stared at what was beneath it. It was an old rocking chair, its wood faded and worn, its seat covered in dust. But what really caught my attention was the way the chair was positioned. It wasn't just sitting there quietly. It was rocking back and forth ever so slightly, as though someone had just gotten up from it. My heart slammed in my chest, and for the first time since moving in, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. I stepped back, my pulse racing, and stumbled toward the attic door. I couldn't get the feeling that I wasn't alone, that something had been sitting in that chair, watching me. The scratching sound came again, but this time it was followed by a low whisper, so faint I could barely make it out. It was as though the words were being spoken from far away, but I could feel them, the vibrations in my bones urging me to leave. I didn't need any further encouragement. I rushed down the stairs and out of the house, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I stood in the yard, trying to steady my nerves. I had no idea what I had just experienced, but it felt wrong, unnatural. I couldn't explain it, and I didn't want to. All I wanted was to get away from that house, but a strange pull kept me there. I had nowhere else to go, and somehow I knew that I wasn't leaving that easily. The following nights were no better. I would try to go to sleep, only to be kept awake by strange noises, footsteps that echoed in the hall, whispers that seemed to come from nowhere. I'd hear the scraping of the rocking chair again, the faint creak of floorboards, and then the silence would fall like a blanket over everything. I began to dread the evenings, the moments when the sun dipped below the horizon and the house seemed to take on a life of its own. But it wasn't just the noises that unsettled me, it was the feeling of being watched. No matter where I went, I could feel eyes on me. At times, it felt as if the house itself were alive, as though it was aware of my every movement. The walls would groan, the floorboards would creak, and I would feel the unmistakable sensation of someone or something following me, always just out of sight. One night, after a particularly long day of trying to make the house feel more like home, I sat down on the couch in the living room, trying to relax. I turned on the TV, but the flickering of the screen seemed to make the shadows in the corners of the room grow larger. I could feel the weight of the silence pressing in on me, suffocating me. I glanced at the old clock on the wall. It was nearly midnight. And then, just as I was about to turn off the TV and go to bed, I saw it. A figure standing in the doorway. I froze, my blood running cold. The figure was tall, shadowy, and indistinct, standing motionless in the doorway, its face hidden in the darkness. It didn't move, didn't make a sound. It was just there, watching me. I couldn't speak. I couldn't move. My body was paralyzed with fear, my mind screaming at me to run, to escape, but my legs refused to obey. The figure remained in the doorway, and then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it vanished. The air in the room felt thick, oppressive, and the silence seemed to stretch on forever. I couldn't stay there any longer. I gathered what little courage I had left and ran out of the house into the cold night. I didn't look back. The next morning, I packed up my things and left the house, leaving behind everything I had tried to rebuild. I never returned. And though I couldn't explain what I had seen or heard, I knew one thing for sure: that house wasn't just old, it was haunted. And whatever lingered there, whatever was watching, wasn't ready to let go. Story the end.
Story number 14.
The town of Hollow Creek sat quietly beneath the shadow of the mountain. its streets lined with old oak trees that had seen more years than any of the residents cared to admit. The homes were mostly small cottages, with white picket fences and gardens overflowing with wildflowers in the summer. The town's population was small, barely more than 200 people. Most of them were content with their simple, peaceful lives. But for all its charm, Hollow Creek had its secrets. The first time I visited Hollow Creek was 2 years ago, when I had been sent to investigate a series of strange occurrences at an old bed and breakfast on the outskirts of town. I was a journalist at the time, just beginning to carve out a name for myself writing about local mysteries and unexplained events. The bed and breakfast had been in operation for over 50 years, but recently the new owners had begun reporting strange happenings. Lights turning on and off by themselves, items being moved, and a cold draft that seemed to follow guests from room to room. I had arrived late in the evening, my car headlights cutting through the mist that had started rolling down from the mountain. The bed and breakfast sat just outside of town, its silhouette barely visible against the gray sky. It was an old Victorian-style house, complete with a wraparound porch and tall, narrow windows. There was a certain eerie quality to the place, but nothing that screamed haunted. Inside, I met the owners, Jack and Clara Turner, who greeted me warmly, though their nervous energy was palpable. They were an older couple, both in their late 60s, with the kind of warmth that suggested they had spent most of their lives in the town. Jack had a gruff voice and a thick beard, while Clara was delicate with silver-streaked hair and a soft, quiet demeanor. They had been running the bed and breakfast together for over 25 years, but recently, they said, something had changed. I remember sitting in the parlor that night, sipping the tea Clara had brewed for me. The house creaked with every gust of wind, and the fire crackled in the hearth. The conversation, though cordial, was tinged with an undertone of something deeper, something unspoken. "We don't want to scare you," Jack said after a long silence, "but there's something in this house. We felt it for a long time, but lately, it's gotten worse." Clara nodded, her eyes tired. At first, we thought it was just the old house settling, but then it started getting more persistent. We've heard things, footsteps in the halls at night, whispers when no one's there. I nodded, trying to remain skeptical. I had heard these kinds of stories countless times before, and more often than not, they were simply the product of overactive imaginations. But the way Clara's hands trembled as she poured the tea, and the look of unease in Jack's eyes, made me wonder if maybe there was something more to it. As the night went on, they showed me to my room, a small, cozy space at the top of the stairs with antique furniture and lace curtains. The bed was large, the comforter thick and inviting. Clara wished me a good night and left me to my own devices, but I could sense her reluctance to leave. The air in the house felt heavy, thick with the kind of tension you only get in places where things are left unsaid. I unpacked my things, set up my notebook on the desk by the window, and sat for a while, jotting down some notes about the night. The clock on the wall ticked loudly in the silence of the room. The house, as I had expected, seemed to settle with every passing minute, creaks and groans from the wooden beams, the sound of wind rustling through the trees outside. Eventually, I decided to get some rest. I turned off the lamp beside the bed, leaving the room in near total darkness, save for the faint glow of the moon through the window. The sheets were cool against my skin, and the pillow was soft. For a moment, I almost felt at peace, as though I could sleep right there, despite the strange feeling that lingered in the room. But then I heard it, a soft tapping. At first, I thought it was the wind, but the sound was too deliberate, too precise. It came from somewhere near the door, soft but persistent. Tap, tap, tap. I sat up in bed, listening intently. The house was still and silent, except for the tapping. It was faint, almost like a whisper in the dark. I waited for it to stop, but it didn't. The sound continued, slowly, rhythmically, as if someone was gently tapping on the door, trying to get my attention. I got out of bed, my heart racing. The door was shut tightly, the lock securely fastened. I glanced around the room, half expecting to see someone standing there in the darkness. But there was no one. I reached for the doorknob, my hand trembling slightly, and pulled the door open. Nothing. I stepped into the hallway, which was dimly lit by a flickering wall sconce. The air felt colder here, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I called out, asking if anyone was there, but there was no response. The hallway was empty, save for the occasional gust of wind that made the doors creak on their hinges. I stood there for a moment, feeling a sense of unease settle in my stomach. I chalked it up to the strange atmosphere of the house and the nervous energy of the Turners. But when I turned back to my room, I heard the tapping again. Only this time, it was coming from deeper within the house. My pulse quickened as I looked down the hallway, which seemed to stretch endlessly into the dark. I couldn't see anything beyond the faint glow of the sconces, but I could feel the presence of something else. A weight in the air, an energy that hadn't been there before. I hesitated for a moment, then began to walk toward the sound. It grew louder with each step, the rhythmic tapping now mixed with a faint whispering. As I approached the end of the hallway, I saw a door at the far end. It was slightly ajar, and the light from the sconce barely illuminated the room beyond. The tapping stopped abruptly, and the whispering followed. I don't know why I stepped closer to the door. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the need to prove there was nothing to be afraid of. But as I reached the door, I could feel the cold air rushing out from the cracks. The whispers were louder now, the words impossible to make out. I reached for the doorknob, my breath catching in my throat, and pushed the door open. The room beyond was empty, just an old study, filled with bookshelves and a desk covered in yellowed papers. The window was cracked open, letting in the chill of the night. The room seemed perfectly normal, but the energy in it felt wrong, like someone had been there just moments before and was now gone. That's when I saw it. On the desk just in front of the window was a small trinket, a tiny porcelain doll, its face cracked and chipped, its eyes dark and unblinking. It was placed deliberately in the center of the desk, as if someone had left it there for me to find. I stepped closer, my hand reaching out instinctively, but before I could touch it, the door slammed shut behind me with a loud bang. I spun around, my heart racing. The room was silent again, the tapping and whispering gone. I tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. I pulled harder, panic beginning to set in, and just as I was about to scream, the door opened on its own. I ran out of the room, my breath coming in short gasps. I didn't stop until I reached the safety of my room, where I locked the door behind me. I collapsed onto the bed, my body shaking with fear. What had just happened? What was that thing in the study? And why did it feel like the house itself was alive, watching me? The rest of the night passed in a blur. I couldn't sleep, my mind racing with thoughts of what I had just experienced. The tapping, the whispers, the porcelain doll, it all seemed like a bad dream, but it was real. I knew it was real. The next morning, I woke to find the sun shining brightly through the window and the house quiet. Jack and Clara were waiting for me in the kitchen, offering a warm breakfast. They seemed like they had not a care in the world, as if nothing had happened. "Sleep well?" Clara asked, her voice soft and welcoming. I hesitated before answering. I'm not sure." Jack gave me a concerned look, but didn't press further. "Sometimes the house gets to people. It's been like this for years. We've gotten used to it. But I knew then that I hadn't gotten used to it, and I never would." When I left Hollow Creek that afternoon, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me. The weight of the house, the tapping, the whispers, they stayed with me. I never returned to the bed and breakfast, and to this day, I've never written about what I experienced there. Some things are better left unsaid. Story the end.
Story number 15.
It was one of those cold autumn nights when the wind howled through the trees and the air felt thick as if it was carrying some unspoken secret. I had just moved into a small, remote cabin in the woods, far from the bustle of the city. It was a place I had dreamed of for years, a peaceful retreat to get away from it all. I had always wanted to experience life in nature, to find some peace and solitude away from the noise of my daily existence. The cabin itself was charming, nestled between towering pine trees and with a view of a small creek that ran behind it. It seemed perfect, and I couldn't have been happier to escape the city. The first few days were blissful. I spent my time unpacking, organizing, and slowly adjusting to the quiet. The only sounds were the chirping of birds during the day and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. I had no neighbors for miles, which was exactly what I had wanted. But as the days wore on, the silence began to feel heavier. The isolation, which had initially felt comforting, started to feel oppressive. I began to notice little things, small, insignificant details that would have seemed normal anywhere else but were out of place here. One evening, after a long day of hiking in the woods, I returned to the cabin and decided to make a pot of tea. It was getting late, and the sun was already setting behind the mountains. The sky turned a deep orange, casting an eerie glow over the cabin. I sat at the kitchen table, sipping my tea and watching the shadows grow long on the walls. The air felt colder inside the house, even though the fireplace was lit and crackling warmly. A chill ran down my spine, but I dismissed it, telling myself it was just the draft from the old wooden walls. It was just past 9 p.m. when I first heard the noise. At first, it was barely noticeable, a soft creak, almost like someone stepping on the floorboards upstairs. I looked up from my tea, trying to identify the source of the sound. The cabin had 2 floors, with a small attic above. I knew it was an old house, but I didn't expect it to make noises like that. I stood up and walked through the small living room to the staircase that led to the second floor. Everything seemed still, the kind of stillness that presses in on you, making every sound feel amplified. I shook my head and walked back to the kitchen, convincing myself it was nothing more than the house settling. Old houses have a way of doing that, I told myself. But then it came again, louder this time, a distinct creak followed by the unmistakable sound of something dragging across the floor. My heart skipped a beat and I felt a cold shiver run through me. I stood frozen for a moment, unsure of what to do. I had been alone in the cabin for days, and there was no one else who could have made the noise. I walked cautiously toward the stairs again, my footsteps muffled by the old wooden floors. The sound came from above, heavy, slow, dragging. It was unmistakable now. Someone or something was up there. With my pulse racing, I took the first step onto the staircase, feeling the old wood groan beneath my weight. I called out, trying to sound confident, though my voice betrayed me. "Hello? Is anyone there?" No response, just silence. The dragging sound stopped, and I held my breath, waiting. But nothing came. My nerves were on edge, and I was starting to feel like I was losing my mind. I turned to leave when I heard it again, a faint scraping, followed by a low, muffled thud. I immediately froze. I don't know why, but I had to investigate. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe it was fear, or maybe it was the fact that I had been alone for far too long. I took the steps slowly, each creak of the floorboards making my heart race faster. At the top of the stairs, I found myself standing in front of the door to the attic. The handle was cold to the touch, and for a moment I simply stood there, staring at the door as if expecting it to open on its own. But nothing happened. Gathering all my courage, I opened the door. The attic was dark, save for the slivers of light that filtered through the cracks in the walls. The air was thick with dust, and the room smelled musty. Old furniture was covered in white sheets, and boxes were stacked against the walls. It looked like an abandoned storage space, untouched for years. As I stepped into the attic, my foot caught on something, a small, weathered box. I bent down to pick it up, my breath visible in the chilly air. As I did, I noticed something strange. On the floor near the corner of the room, there was a faint outline in the dust, as if something had recently been moved. My mind raced, but before I could investigate further, I heard the sound again. A dragging noise, closer this time, as if something or someone was coming toward me. I spun around, my heart hammering in my chest. The room was empty. There was nothing there. The only sound was the creaking of the house and my own rapid breathing. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, trying to make sense of what was happening. It didn't make sense. There was no one else in the cabin, no one who could be making the noise. Yet there it was, unmistakable. Suddenly I felt it, a cold, icy breath against the back of my neck. I turned around quickly, but no one was there. The attic was as empty as it had been before. I felt my legs shake, and I grabbed onto the edge of the attic's low wooden beam to steady myself. I had to get out of there. I had to leave. But the panic rising in my chest made it hard to think clearly. As I turned to leave, the dragging sound came again, louder this time, right behind me. It was so close I could almost feel the presence of whatever it was. I bolted down the stairs, my heart pounding in my chest. I had to get out of that house. I didn't know what was happening, but I couldn't stay there any longer. As I reached the bottom of the stairs, I felt the unmistakable sensation of being watched. My eyes darted around the room, but there was nothing there. Still, the feeling lingered, as if something unseen was observing my every move. I rushed to the front door, my hands trembling as I fumbled with the lock. It was stuck, and I couldn't get it open. My breath came in quick gasps as I pulled and twisted at the handle, panic flooding my mind. The door wouldn't open. I slammed my shoulder against it, but it refused to budge, and then I heard it, soft, almost like a whisper, but so clear. The voice seemed to come from right behind me. Leave. It was a single word spoken in a low, raspy voice, and it sent a chill through my body. I didn't need any more encouragement. I grabbed my bag and bolted for the back door, throwing it open and running into the woods. I didn't stop until I reached the neighbor's cabin several miles down the road, my chest heaving, my legs burning from the sprint. I spent the rest of the night in a state of panic, too afraid to return to the cabin. The next morning, I went back with a friend to gather my things. The house was silent again, too silent, but nothing felt right. It felt as if something was waiting for me to come back, as if the house itself had something to say. I never returned to that cabin after that night. I left everything behind, my belongings, my dreams of living peacefully in the woods, and moved back to the city. To this day, I still don't know what I experienced that night, but I know one thing for sure. The house in those woods was not just a cabin. It was a place where something dark lingered, something that wanted me gone. Story the end.